Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper, and today I want to tell you about the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini. And that's why I'm standing in front of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, because that's where it is. Well, actually I'm pretending to be standing in front of a church. I'm actually standing in front of a green screen. I was there a few years ago and I tried to make this video there. And I did this very same speech in front of the church with a selfie stick, and then I shot some footage inside the church as well. But the trouble is I'm a terrible cameraman and the footage didn't come out that well. And that's why I'm standing in front of a green screen to give it another go. So, in this video I'm going to be using some of my own footage that I shot a few years ago, and you will see that it's shaky and probably a little bit grainy as well. And I will also use some decently shot photographs that I found online. But I think it's important in this case to use some video from the inside of the church, because what we're going to look at is not just a sculpture, it's much more than that. What Bernini did is he used the entire chapel and actually most of the church to make an almost theatrical setting. That is all part of the entire work of art. But before we go in and look at the chapel, which by the way is known as the Cornaro Chapel, let me tell you a little bit about the church. And let me get out of the way. The church was built by Carlo Maderno. He was an earlier Baroque architect who became famous after he built the facade of Santa Susanna, which is a church just across the road from where this church is. Pope Paul V liked it so much that he asked Maderno to then build the facade for St. Peter's, and that is his biggest work and probably his most well-known work as well. And I think also his most despised one. Personally, I think it's a perfectly good facade, but I actually had several classes back in university where different professors tried to tell me just how terrible they thought it was. But again, I think it's a perfectly good facade for a huge church. But he also built this little church, which was first started back in 1607, when the church bought the ground to build it on. It was to be a church for the order of the Discalced Carmelites, who were to have a monastery and a convent next door. Both of those still exist today, and they still use the church as their chapel. Now, the Carmelites were an ancient order of hermit monks and nuns, but in the 16th century in Spain, a reform movement of the order was started by Saint Teresa of Avila, the very saint we're going to have a look at inside. So it's apt to have her depicted inside. But while they were digging in the ground before starting to build, workers came across a curious sculpture. Now, this being Rome, it's not strange to find sculptures when you start digging, and so they immediately contacted some of the big collectors of ancient sculptures. And in this case they found an interested party in Scipione Borghese. He was a cardinal and nephew to Pope Paul V, and a huge art collector, and he also built the Villa Borghese, which still houses his enormous collection. And in it you can still see this sculpture that they found there. The sculpture is actually Hermaphrodite, and in mythology it was a son of Hermes and a daughter of Aphrodite. And she was so much obsessed with him that when she had the chance, she jumped him, and they merged into a being with both male and female aspects, a hermaphrodite. Now, Scipione Borghese didn't pay directly for the sculpture, but he did make sure that the best architects were made available for the construction and the design of the church, and he then paid them. Also, Borghese was the patron of the young Bernini. You can find several of his earlier works in the Villa Borghese, and I made a video about one of them. But he also asked Bernini to make this mattress for the sculpture, because the sculpture itself, the figure itself, is ancient, but the mattress was made by Bernini, who was then still a very young artist. Now you might think that because of Scipione Borghese's involvement in the building of this church, that he had some sort of say in the decorations on the inside, and got Bernini involved. But that's not the case, as we will see. Now, originally, the church was to be dedicated to St. Paul, which had everything to do with the fact that the Pope at the time was called Paul V. But after it had been dedicated, they changed it. And it became the Church of Saint Mary of the Victory, because that is what the name Santa Maria della Vittoria means. And it refers to a specific victory. And that is the victory of the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620. This was a battle between Protestants and Catholics in Bohemia, which was won by the Catholic side. And legend has it that they were helped by an image of the Virgin Mary that during the battle was raised, and then her eyes started to shine light so brightly that it blinded the Protestants. And that very image was then taken to Rome and placed in this church. So it's a very literal victory that it refers to. But at other times, other victories have been associated with the church. For instance, the siege of Vienna in 1683 by the Turkish armies was lifted when Catholic armies, mainly the Polish, defeated the Turks. And to commemorate that, there are actually still several of the Turkish standards in Santa Maria della Vittoria. Now, the church was dedicated in 1620 and very quickly rededicated. But so far, Bernini had not been involved with this church. Instead, his patron, Scipione Borghese, had made sure that Bernini received a number of other very prestigious commissions from the church and others. He was decorating St. Peter's and building St. Peter's Square. He was constructing fountains throughout the city and so much more. He was in fact incredibly prolific because he worked with a huge workshop and was one of the most sought-after artists of his age and maybe even in history. And it certainly helped that several popes really liked him personally. But that lucky streak ended with Innocent X, a pope from the Pamphili family who didn't like Bernini at all and decided not to hire him anymore for any of the big church commissions. And that suddenly freed up a lot of the time Bernini had, which is why, even in his prime, the height of his career, he had the time to take up a small commission like this one, which in a way was lucky for Cardinal Federico Cornaro, because he was looking for an artist to decorate this chapel. He had just bought it and he wanted to be buried there. And suddenly the most spectacular artist of his time was available to design and decorate a small chapel. And he did it in true Bernini style. It is innovative and truly spectacular. And as we walk into the church, we will see it. It is near the altar to the left. And instead of just making one sculptural group, he decorated the entire chapel and used every means available to make it spectacular. And you can see that Bernini, amongst all his other activities, had been very active in designing stages for theaters, because that influence is easy to see here. You see, the main sculpture, that of Saint Teresa and the angel, is set in this bit of architecture known as an edicule, which makes it look as if they're on a stage. And this isn't just a modern interpretation of it. It is clearly something he referenced himself, because if we look to the sides of the chapel, we can see he incorporated an audience as if they are sitting on the balconies watching the performance. These are portraits of Cardinal Cornaro and his family. This is what I meant by saying it's not just the sculpture, it's the whole chapel. And that includes every bit of decoration, so also the frescoes on the ceiling and the lighting. Because the light and the way he used it makes this an unforgettable design. You can see that there's a window above the sculptural group. It's a stained glass window and it simply provides outside light. It even shines light on that little fresco up there that would otherwise be in the dark. And there we can see a dove, which is the Holy Spirit, that inspires the setting below. But there's another window, which is hidden from view just below this one. And we can see it from the outside. The one on top is the stained glass window that we've just seen. And the one below that is hidden, but if we turn back inside, you can see that there's light coming from an unseen source on our stage below. That's that extra window doing that. And from this kind of awkward angle, you can even see the window or the stained glass that he put in front of it, which helps to give the light a golden glow. And to emphasize that, he used stuccoed and then gilded rays of sunlight. So it seems like the light is just sort of gliding in along those rays. Also, the saint and the angel are placed on something I guess is supposed to be clouds. But there's a lot of room underneath it, which is therefore placed in the shade. And that darkness helps to amplify the sensation of light above and the idea, of course, that they are floating in the air. Now these days there's, of course, modern lighting in the church. And it's sometimes switched on and sometimes switched off. And this is one of those rare occasions where modern lighting actually makes the experience of seeing it less spectacular. So if you are there, you really need to wait for a moment when it's turned off, because that's when you get the best view. Now the whole effect works best because they are in this enclosed space where Bernini could really control the light. And so far I haven't even talked about the sculpture itself yet, which is absolutely spectacular in and of itself. So let's have a closer look. We see Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a nun of the Carmelite order and became the founder of this new version of the Discalced Carmelites. She had lived in the 16th century. She actually died in 1582. So for Bernini and his generation, this was fairly recent history. And she was made a saint in almost record time, in 1620. So just about when this church was first finished. Only 24 years before Bernini started to work on this project. She was a mystic and author of at least 3 books in which he described her religious life and in some cases her religious ecstasies. And it's one of those episodes that we see depicted here. It's one that she actually wrote about, so I can quote her words to you from her autobiography, and I quote, "I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the iron point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart, and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. The soul is satisfied now with nothing less than God. The pain is not bodily, but spiritual, though the body has its share in it. It is a caressing of love so sweet, which now takes place between the soul and God, that I pray God of his goodness to make him experience it who may think that I am lying." End quote. So that's what we're seeing here. Saint Teresa is visited by an angel, which she said was so beautiful she thought it was of the highest order of angels, and he stands over her with a long spear of gold, which looks a bit like an arrow in this case. But it's gilded so it catches the light more and expresses that idea of a bit of fire at the end. He also smiles as he, quite unnecessarily, opens up her robes and is about to plunge it in. And just look at what an incredible sculptor Bernini really was. When you look at the angel and his wings with the soft feathers, all made out of the same marble, but they seem to be of completely different materials. Also you can see the angel's clothing is of a soft and flowing material, while the robes of Saint Teresa are harder and more coarse. The folds are much more angular to show us that it's a thick and hard material. And then there's the cloud that they're on, which is made out of a seemingly roughly hewn marble. We see her in her ecstasy, and she is lying back in complete surrender to this experience. Her mouth is open and her body seems completely relaxed. One hand, her right, is lying open and the other is just hanging down. And from the angle of her feet, we can tell that her legs are relaxed but also not held together. And that is one of the comments that Bernini received when it was first unveiled. Some have seen this ecstasy as somewhat improper. For instance, she has bare feet. Carmelite nuns always wore sandals with heavy woolen stockings because bare feet were considered to be immodest. And there is an undeniable sexuality to this sculptural group. Both the angel and Saint Teresa seem to be enjoying themselves tremendously. And I doubt it's just my dirty mind that sees that. There's a story that there was one French ambassador who was shown this chapel, and he remarked, "If this is divine ecstasy, then I know it well." Nevertheless, it's one of the most spectacular sculptures by Bernini, which makes it one of the most spectacular sculptures ever made, in my opinion. One of the details everybody misses when discussing these things is that Bernini designed most of the decorations of the church, and included in that there had to be a pendant to this sculpture, which is right on the other side of the nave. It depicts the dream of Saint Joseph, where an angel visited him in his dreams and told him his wife was going to have a baby and it was the child of God. You can see that there's a similar theme of an angel visiting someone, and it kind of echoes Saint Teresa in its form. It's by Domenico Guidi, who was certainly a very capable and actually very good sculptor, but it's also really easy to see how much less spectacular this one is compared to the work of Bernini. Now, through all of this, I haven't even mentioned yet that this church was featured in the book and movie Angels and Demons. I doubt that they actually filmed it here, because that scene was rather destructive, but still was set here. Now, of course, you have to go and see this for yourself. It is so much more beautiful in person than I could ever show you in a video. But before you pack your bags, please remember to like and subscribe. And I'd like to thank you very much for watching. See you again soon. Bye.